US revives plans for a nuclear first strike on Russia. Coming up.
Soft assassinations of anti-NATO leaders. Star Wars, tested for Eastern Europe. And US space weapons, a quote, unofficial declaration of war.
Secret clauses of NATO membership state the US can and will depose Europe's governments on the orders of the White House.
Even if the electorate were to show a different inclination, secret protocols guarantee alignment by any means.
By any means exactly that. Early NATO whistleblower Hans Otto exposed, quote, kill lists of leading European politicians that defied investigators' beliefs, but were subsequently confirmed by police. Officers found 15 pages of members of the German Communist Party to be assassinated and 80 pages on Germany's Social Democrats, one of the two major parties in the country. The documents state these assassinations would take place in case of X. X may refer, writes NATO scholar Dr. Daniel Ganser, to mass protests against a US-backed government or an election victory of a genuinely left-wing party. Instructions for such operations were kept at NATO military headquarters south of Brussels. Der Spiegel reveals a, quote, strictly secured wing of the building. A grey steel bank vault door prohibits trespassing to the unauthorized. Papers on NATO operations in Europe are marked American eyes only. When the EU Parliament officially demanded NATO stop these operations, which have become known by the codename Gladio, the US simply ignored it. Richard Cottrell is a former member of the European Parliament. NATO tried to ban his investigation, Gladio, NATO's dagger at the heart of Europe, which reports both so-called soft assassinations, smearing non-aligned EU politicians through mainstream media to make them unelectable, and real assassinations of politicians that still got elected. Richard joins us. Really great to see you. What's going on?
The United States is not prepared to tolerate governments which are unfavorable to the regime. Let's give the example of Syriza in Greece at the moment, which is just one, come top of the list in the European elections. This is an example of a government which is not going to be tolerated by the United States of America.
Yeah, you write a prototype soft assassinations British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, whose, quote, blasphemy in American eyes was to flirt with nuclear disarmament.
Yes, it's become a little bit more difficult to, shall we say, use violent means than it was in the past. So now you're going to see a lot more of the Harold Wilson tactics. And they will now increase, and I'll tell you why. Because this weekend, the European elections were held, and this has resulted in a very large bloc of anti-Europeans, led by the Le Penista, the National Front of France, which has come out on top in the European elections. Nigel Farage, leader of the United Kingdom Independence Party in the UK, who has come from virtually nowhere to become the leader of the third largest party. This will not be allowed to happen. So there have to be Harold Wilson-type moves now to remove those leaderships and those parties in those various countries.
NATO is attempting to supersede and actually replace the United Nations, reveals former Assistant General Hans Sponek. Its revised doctrine refuses the UN monopoly on the use of force, reports Global Research News. NATO now promotes itself as the military wing of the UN itself. The doctrine reserves the right to intervene anywhere in the world where there's, quote, movements of large numbers of persons. Its newly formed Partners Across the Globe programs already incorporated Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Pakistan and Iraq, and leads the occupation of Afghanistan. With the expected addition of states like Colombia and El Salvador, NATO will be on all 6 inhabited continents. Obama's foreign policy guru Zbigniew Brzezinski calls people in countries under US control vassals, a medieval term for slaves. American armed forces are now in over 150 countries. The unofficial figure, including clandestine US forces, is thought to be much higher. The Pentagon recently formed the United States Africa Command. Since then, NATO's dispatched the continent's most developed nation to a Hobbesian anarchy. overthrew the Ivory Coast and chopped Sudan's oil-rich southern half into a new state, leaving just 2.5 countries still outside its military grid. Leading military analyst, editor of the news list Stop NATO, Rick Rozoff, joins us. Great to see you. What will happen to people when the last countries fall to US control?
Global enslavement is the answer to that, and we see it manifested, for example, in ways that may not be immediately obvious, but after a certain amount of analysis we can see. For example, votes that have come up in the United Nations General Assembly in the last year and a half, 2 years, particularly I'm thinking on the question of Syria. We see that the U.S., through a number of factors, economic bribery, diplomatic blackmail, subversion, but also through bilateral and multilateral military programs, has been able to secure the overwhelming compliance or servility of other nations. And that's one of the reasons why there's no diplomatic and political independence in nations, because they're beholden to the United States, and frankly speaking, they're fearful of U.S. economic and ultimately military retaliation should they not go along with U.S. diktat.
So today, I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I'm not naive.
Obama's duplicity is perhaps historically unparalleled. As soon as he envisioned a planet without nuclear weapons, he mushroomed nuclear weapons spending to levels above the height of the Cold War. He's expanded the infamous Bush doctrine of a nuclear strike against any country, regardless of international law. Full-spectrum dominance is the official term used by his administration, meaning, quote, control everything everywhere on sea, land, air, space, and outer space. US Space Command documents plan to even deny other nations the use of space. The one remaining power with the capacity to stop what the Pentagon calls full-spectrum dominance, writes intelligence analyst William Engdahl, is Russia. By design or coincidence, crisis in Ukraine's provided the perfect excuse for US military control of the region. 10 days ago, the administration tested its Star Wars system for Eastern Europe, which will now be rolled out starting in Romania. Obama brands his system the stronger, smarter, and swifter version of Ronald Reagan's initial Star Wars program. Under the plan, the US attacks Russia with nuclear weapons, while NATO missile defense in Eastern Europe mops up any attempted response. MSNBC News writes it's most likely and understandable Russia interprets NATO's Star Wars deployment on its borders as an unofficial declaration of war. Aerospace analysts told Global Research that US Space Command is planning a nuclear-first strike on Russia, as well as one on China in 2016. Bruce Gagnon of the Global Network Against Weapons in Space joins us. Thank you very much for coming on. What do we know about the first strike plans?
This is in the planning process today. The U.S. Space Command practicing engaging in a first strike attack. And this is the key element here, is that these are first strike attack planning. These so-called missile defense systems are key elements in U.S. first strike attack planning. The idea is to hit China or Russia first with a first strike, and then when they try to fire their nuclear retaliatory capability, it is then that these so-called missile defense systems would be used to pick off any retaliatory strike. So after a first strike sword is thrust into the heart of China or Russia, then the missile defense shield would be used to pick off any retaliation, and giving the U.S. a quote-unquote successful first strike attacks. It has nothing at all to do with defense. It has nothing to do with freedom or democracy or any of those words that are used all the time to disguise the true intentions. It's all about full spectrum dominance.
Several decades ago, the first Star Wars initiative faced intense public and industry debate. Today, the US is controlled by just 6 mainstream media, all totally suborned to the White House. The result is an Orwellian silence on perhaps the most dangerous issue today. Europeans may decide they want their leaders chosen by NATO, or even that they support nuclear strikes on China and Russia. Since the US-controlled mainstreams never even informed the public these apocalyptic plans are on the agenda, the first people may hear of it would be this. Seek truth from facts. This is The Truth Seeker.